I tend to talk fast. I'm going to try very hard to talk slowly. If I start talking fast, just raise your hand and wave, and I will know to slow down. I guess while we're waiting, I just want to thank both Luciana and Thiago, who have just been incredibly warm and gracious. And I just had a really wonderful time here in Rio today. Really good food, really good company. And so, I just, so thank you to both of them. Okay. Okay. Hey, excellent. Okay. So I thought I'm going to talk tonight about mindfulness meditation. One of the questions I always get is, because most of my research is on mindfulness meditation, people say, well, I practice yoga, I practice Tai Chi, I practice some other form of meditation. What about that? And so I always just like to address that first. The idea is that with different types of exercise, all forms of exercise are generally beneficial. But we know, for instance, that if you go to the gym and lift weights, that's good for developing your arm muscles, but it doesn't do much for your leg muscles. Similarly, if you run or play golf or play soccer, football, each of those requires slightly different skills. So all of them are going to promote general health, but also each is going to provide some specific benefits. And the data is starting to show the same with the different types of yoga and meditation and Tai Chi, that all of them are generally beneficial for health, but there are some subtle differences. We don't know yet, though there hasn't been a lot of studies directly comparing one form to another. So we can't say yet that, if you go to the doctor's office, that you should practice Tai Chi, you should practice mindfulness, you should practice yoga. We're just not there yet. But that's a hope someday that we would know, we get that sort of understanding. Okay. So I'm going to talk today about mindfulness. What is mindfulness exactly? Here we have a common definition that's often cited. Purposefully paying attention to experiences in the present moment in a non-judgmental way. And each of these components is important. So first off is purposely paying attention. So all of us pay attention. Right now you're all paying attention. But with mindfulness, it's paying attention in a very particular way. And there's an element of awareness. So you know that you're paying attention. And that's a really key element of mindfulness. The second component is the present moment. You always want to be aware of what's actually happening now. So if you find yourself thinking about something that happened earlier in the day or planning something for tomorrow, then that's probably not mindfulness. Particularly in the context of emotion regulation, if you find your mind spinning out of control, like, oh my God, what if? The way to be mindful is to bring yourself back to the present moment and to be aware of what's going on right now and to let go of what's might happen in the future. And the last bit is a non-judging way. That's also extremely important. The idea is that when you have this experience, it doesn't matter what it is, it's just your experience. And we're not trying to label it as good or bad. So here in this cartoon, we see the man and the dog, and the man's mind is full of all sorts of thoughts and ideas, but not trees or sun. Whereas the dog is just noticing the sun and the trees, probably some good smells. Right, and nothing else. And that's kind of our goal, is that when we're outside, we just notice the beauty of nature, right? And just aware of the sun, how the sun feels on our face, what we're actually seeing as we walk down the street. And this is how we practice being mindful. Just being aware of what our actual present moment experience is, rather than all the stuff we normally think about. So there's many different types of meditation, as I mentioned. Importantly, mindfulness does not include mantra. Instead, the primary focus is body sensations. So contact of the breath with the nose, or the rise and fall of the abdomen as we breathe. It could also be, like I said, the sun on our face as we're walking, or the contact of our feet with the ground. It could be sounds. And the key thing is a conscious awareness of the present moment. So we're not lost in thought, we're not spaced out, and we're not in a trance. We're just very aware of the present moment. And again, having this non-judging attitude. So for instance, right now, if I stop talking, you can hear the traffic going by. Now some people might be like, okay, well, traffic, and have all these thoughts about, oh, I have to drive home in that, and it's making so much sound, and what's it doing to our environment? That's all the judging. We want to try to just drop that and just notice there's loud sounds happening outside, right? That there's motors, there's a louder sound, there's a softer sound, the growling sound. Can we just get in tune with experience at that level rather than trying? The first study what we did was we recruited people who practiced meditation for many years, and we put them in the MRI scanner. And we had them lie there and do nothing, and then meditate. And when I first told people I was doing this study, they laughed. Because a lot of people thought that meditation was just lying there quietly. They didn't think there was going to be any difference between the meditation period and the lying there doing nothing period. But as you can see, that's not the case. These red spots on the brain indicate where there's more brain activity during meditation compared to just lying there doing nothing. So what are these brain regions? This is our insula, which Thiago had mentioned. This is our temporal pole. And this is our prefrontal cortex. I'm going to be telling you a lot more about the insula in a few minutes. But for now, the interesting thing to know about these three brain regions is that together, they perform a very important role. So the outer shell of the brain is called the cortex. And this is where thinking and reasoning, problem solving happens. Buried down deep in the middle of the brain, you have your amygdala, the hippocampus, the caudate. That's called the limbic system. And the limbic system is where emotions happen, bodily sensations, and not so much thinking and problem solving. And what's interesting is that for the most part, the cortex and the limbic system do not talk to each other directly, except in these three regions. What's also interesting is that the type of neurons here in these three regions are very different than the other parts of the brain. And they have both types of neurons because there's different neurons in the cortex and in the limbic system, and they have both types here. So if you think about the cortex as being thinking and sort of mind, and we think about the limbic system as being emotions and body, then these three regions together, you could sort of, in a very loose hand-waving sort of way, think about being a mind-body regions, because they're integrating the information of the mind and the body together. So it's really interesting that those are the three regions we found to be active during meditation. The other thing we found was the amygdala. That was one of the regions that Thiago mentioned. It's important for fight or flight and anxiety. It became less active. And this is consistent with people feeling less anxious and more calm and relaxed. So the next thing we did was we actually looked at brain structure. And we compared these meditation practitioners to controls who had no meditation practice, but they were matched for gender, age, education, and race. And what we found was that there were several brain regions, here in yellow, where there was more gray matter in the long-term meditators than the controls. And just to pause, because I always get asked, what is gray matter? So in the brain, you have gray matter and white matter. You could think about neurons looking sort of like trees, with lots of branches and lots of roots. The gray matter is where the branches from one neuron talk to the roots of the next neuron, and where the thinking actually happens and the problem solving actually happens. And so more gray matter means that there's possibly more branches or more roots, right? And they're just taking up more space. You can also sometimes find more helper cells, like more blood vessels that are also contributing to the thickness. But most likely, it's the increases in the branches and the roots of the neurons. So what are these regions? This big region here, this primary region we found, that's our insula again, right? This is that region that's involved in body awareness and being able to feel what's going on inside our body. It's also involved in integrating thoughts and senses, right? It's one of these mind-body areas. It's also involved in recognizing facial emotions, particularly disgust. And it's smaller in people with schizophrenia and bipolar disorder. The other region we found was here in the front of the brain. This is an area involved in working memory and selective attention, so being able to focus your attention despite distractions. It's involved in many executive functions, including fluid intelligence. What is fluid intelligence? Fluid intelligence is the official fancy name for IQ. So it's the ability to take novel information and use it to solve problems. And what was interesting was when we plotted this data, what we found is that the blue are the meditators and the red are the controls. And it's been really well established that the whole front half of our brain shrinks as we get older. And this is why we get older. It takes us a little longer to figure things out, or we're not quite as sharp as we were when we were younger. And what we see is that, as expected, the controls shrunk with age. But the meditators, the 50-year-old meditators, have the same amount of gray matter as the 20-year-olds, suggesting that meditation may help slow or prevent normal aging from happening in this brain region. So now that first study, we weren't expecting to see this. And so we didn't give anyone an IQ test or do anything like this. But then we repeated the study, and we did the same study again, but this time we gave them the standard IQ test. And it's well known that the IQ test, performance on IQ goes down with age because our front of our brain is shrinking. And what we see is that the solid line is the controls, and as expected, their performance decreases with age. The top line is long-term yoga practitioners. The second line is long-term meditation practitioners. And although there is some decline with age, it's not as dramatic as it is with the controls, suggesting that indeed this increase in brain gray matter is helping to preserve IQ with age. So it really does help you. So now these first studies, I got a lot of criticism. People said, well, you know, people who choose to practice yoga and meditation, they're just different. You know, a lot of them are vegetarians. You know, they're, odd. It's like, hello? Maybe their brains are like that anyways. People who tend to meditate, maybe they just had thick insula for some reason, or the thicker frontal cortex. Maybe that's why they chose to meditate, right? Maybe it's because they take 40 minutes out of their day to rest and relax. I always laugh at that one because of how much TV we watch. We watch way more than 40 minutes a day of TV, right? Maybe it's because they're vegetarian or something else about their lifestyle. it couldn't possibly be due to the meditation. So now these are all legitimate criticisms. So to address that, we said, okay, well, we know about these 8-week MBSR programs, that people go through these programs and they say, oh my God, this changed my life after just 8 weeks. Could we show that the brain changed in just 8 weeks? And so we recruited people who were about to go through the program, excuse me, and we scanned them before and after the program, and we compared them to people who were willing to wait 8 weeks. And so we scanned them 8 weeks apart, and then they took the program. And indeed, there were several brain regions where there's more gray matter after just 8 weeks of practice. So what are these brain regions? Back here, this is called the PCC, or the posterior cingulate. This is the area that's involved in mind wandering and self-related processes. So when you pause as you're walking down the street and you see something in a store and you think, wow, that would look great in my living room. Or, oh, I really need that because that's relevant to me. Your PCC is lighting up. Also, it's the #1 region that is activated when you're just not thinking about anything in particular and you're just sort of daydreaming or lost in thought, is your PCC. The next region here is the temporal parietal junction, and that's an area involved in being able to see things from other people's point of view. It's a very important region involved in empathy and compassion. And then we have the hippocampus, and the hippocampus is important for learning and memory. And what's interesting is that both the hippocampus and the PCC, again, they're both part of the mind wandering, and also they're both regions that are destroyed by Alzheimer's disease, and both of them are getting bigger with meditation. And so sometimes people say, well, hold on, meditation's sort of the opposite of mind wandering. Why is there more gray matter? There are inhibitory neurons that turn off activity, and we think that that might be what's happening with the PCC, because again, that region is destroyed by Alzheimer's disease. And so we think that it grows bigger, and as it gets bigger, it's turning off the mind wandering. The other thing we found was the brainstem. This is an area of the brainstem that in the general area where serotonin and dopamine is produced. And so we didn't measure that, so we can't say for sure that those are changing. But what we found is that the change here correlated with well-being. So people saying, I feel happier, I feel more content with my life, was related to this region specifically. And so we think that, and that would be consistent with more dopamine and more serotonin. So we don't know, but we think that this may be somehow influencing serotonin and dopamine in the brain. And then we also found the amygdala shrunk. And again, the amygdala is the fear and anxiety part of the brain. And what we found is that the more the amygdala shrunk, the more stress reduction people reported. And interesting, because some people, when they go through the programs, actually report more stress, and their amygdala actually got a little bigger. And so we had this really nice correlation between stress and amygdala. And what's interesting is that this is the opposite of what's seen in animals. So in animals, you can take, this is actually a study done with rats. I couldn't find a good picture of a rat, so I'm using Mickey. Sorry if you like Mickey. So what they did is they took a rat and they had it and they measured its amygdala. And then for 10 days, they kept it in a small cage where it couldn't move. And that really stresses out rats. And then they put it back in its original cage where it could move around. And they waited 3 weeks. And they measured the amygdala. And so it started off at normal. It then got bigger at the end of 10 days of being stressed out. What was interesting is at the end of the 3 weeks later, it was still enlarged. And the animals were still acting stressed out, because normally if you take an animal and you put it in a novel environment, it will explore the novel environment. But when they're stressed out, they don't explore. They just sit and cower. And that's what was happening here. And 3 weeks later, it was still sitting and cowering and not exploring. This is the opposite of what we're seeing with MBSR, because nothing about their environment changed. They still had their difficult jobs. All the crazy people in their families are still being crazy. But their amygdala changed, and so did their mood, their stress. So it really demonstrates that it's not that our lives are becoming less stressful because we meditate, but we learn to handle the stress, and we have a new relationship to the stress. And this is really important because obviously, we want to continue our lives. And so, the traffic is still going to be the traffic no matter how much we meditate. But we're going to get less upset about it when we start to practice. Okay. All right, so I told you at the beginning about that's really good for reducing symptoms of depression, anxiety, and pain. And so now I'm going to talk to you about what's happening in the brain and how in the brain it's helping these conditions. This is a study done up in Canada, not by me, by a colleague of mine. And what they did was they had people watch sad clips from movies. So one of them was a mother who had cancer saying goodbye to her children. And a young boy saying goodbye to his dog that's been critically injured. So reliably gets people to start crying. The top line is the meditation group, people who've gone through MBSR. And the bottom is the controls. And just this is brain activity as they're watching these movies. And they're told to just, to be aware and be mindful while they're watching. And what we see is that in the MBSR group, this is the insula again, from a different perspective, we're looking from above now. That's our insula. And here is that anterior cingulate region. So both of these are these mind-body regions we've been talking about. And these areas are more active in the mindfulness group compared to the controls. Meanwhile, the controls are lighting up language areas, right? And areas involved in thinking about emotions rather than actually feeling emotions, right? Because these areas are going to be feeling, the insula is all about feeling things versus this is describing things. And what they found also was that brain activity here in the insula correlated with, inversely correlated with depression scores. So the more activity here during this task, the lower the depression scores. So it really suggests that your ability to really feel your emotions and experience your emotions is important for being able to feel your emotions and to overcome your depressive tendencies, right? So they're getting out of the thinking and getting out of the negative thoughts and just going into those bodily sensations. This was a study done at Stanford University in California. This is with people who had social anxiety, so people who were very nervous to go out in public. And they had them listen to short clips. Before they went in the scanner, they wrote about a situation that made them nervous. So going to a party, having to give a talk in front of people. And while they're in the scanner, they were told to listen and just react, imagine themselves in that situation and react. And then just to breathe and let it go. And then to rate their experience. The solid line is before. The dotted line is after. And this is brain activity in their amygdala, the fear part of the brain. And what we see is that before the program, there's it actually goes down a bit, and then a very big and long, prolonged reaction in the amygdala. And this is consistent with people going, oh, no, oh, and then, having this huge reaction to it. versus afterwards, there's still a little bit of a reaction, right? There's still a little bit of, you know, but it's pretty quick. And then you actually get it turning off. They're actually able to sort of and relax and really let their amygdala get shut off before coming back to baseline. So it really shows that it's changing the fear reaction. It doesn't completely get rid of it, and that's important because you don't, if you're walking in the woods and you see a snake, you want to still have the initial jump back and jump away from the snake. Or if you're driving in traffic and someone cuts in front of you, you need to slam on the brakes. But then you want to just let that fear go, right? So if someone cuts in front of you in traffic, which happens to me frequently, you don't want them to be like, oh my God, that person nearly killed me, and oh my God, who does that person think they are, right? Can you just let it go and say, oh, okay, but I'm safe now, and just keep driving, right? Or in this case, I have to give a talk, it's going to be okay, right? So rather than worry and worry and worry and worry about it, you have the fear, you get the information, you let it go. This is another study done with anxiety. This one, they had people fill out an anxiety questionnaire before they went in the MRI scanner. While they were in the MRI scanner, they did a task, and then they meditated. And this is brain activity during meditation. And then when they came out of the scanner, they had them fill out the anxiety questionnaire again. And here again is our subgenual cingulate and our insula, right? These are the areas that, and this is these are the areas that again we show getting turned on during meditation. And this is the PCC, which is the area that we found getting thicker, which I told you is mind wandering, and that's getting turned off during meditation. Blue is off. And what they found is that more activity in the insula and this cingulate region correlated with the change in anxiety. So the more activity here during meditation, the more your anxiety went down from before to after the scan. So this really does suggest that these areas are important for meditation. They're not just random areas. And that the ability, the more you're able to focus and stay present during your meditation, the more stress reduction you're going to get. There's been many studies of MBSR for pain, for chronic pain. And in general, mindfulness is better than doing nothing. But it's not as good as cognitive therapy. So there's like a therapy, like a talk therapy, right? At least over the course of the initial 8 weeks, right? I mean, it's good, but CBT is a little bit better. But the good thing about mindfulness, though, is that in addition to helping with the pain, it's also really good, though, for reducing depression and also very important for improving coping and secondary symptoms. And this is really important because even CBT does not get rid of the pain. It's really, for most people with chronic pain, the pain never goes away completely. But mindfulness is really good for helping people realize, okay, the pain's not going to go away, and that's okay. I can live with it. And you learn how to tolerate the pain in a new way. And that's really important. Also, because most people with chronic pain have depression and anxiety. And again, is really good for helping with the depression and the anxiety. The other thing that's important is that basically the results were maintained even 1 to 3 years later. That even going through this 1 8-week program, 3 years later, people are still seeing results. So what about the brain? So there's 2 components to pain. One component of pain is the actual physical sensation, the tingling, throbbing, stabbing, burning. The other part of the pain is the emotional component. I don't like it. Make it stop. This is horrible. I don't like it. And what we know is that those are separate in the brain. So this blue network, that's the throbbing, tingling, stabbing component of it. And the brown network is the I don't like it, make it stop. And we know that they're not the same for everybody. What's interesting is if I were to go around the room and to poke you all exactly the same. Whoops. Okay, that's my 10-minute, yeah, okay. And I asked you to rate that on a scale of 1 to 10. You would all probably, in terms of stabbing, tingling, that and intensity, you'd all probably rate it around the same in terms of that intensity. But in terms of the, I don't like it, make it stop, you'd be all over the place. Some of you'd be like, yeah, this wasn't so bad. And others of you would be like, oh my God, that was horrible, don't do that to me again, right? And that has to do with our upbringing, our genetics, our previous experience with pain. What's interesting is that there's many different ways of dealing with pain. And these are the 4 most common. I'll explain them in a moment. And they've all been studied in the scanner. And what's interesting is that all 4 of them look pretty much the same in terms of the brain. So what are they? The first one is distraction, right? So lots of times doctors will do this. They'll say, before you give a shot, they'll say, look over there. And then when you're looking over there, they give you the shot, right? Or they modulate your expectation. This won't hurt a bit, right? Or you can do reappraisal. Okay, this, I'm going to give you something. This shot contains something that's going to make you stronger and healthier. Or you can do placebo. What they do is they say, here's this cream, and this cream has something in it that's going to dull the pain. And even though the cream is just cream and there's nothing in it, but I put that on you first, you'll report that there's less pain if you believe me that there really is something in there that's going to dull the pain. So these seem pretty different, but in the brain they all look the same. What happens is that so normally we have the painful stimulus come in, and it goes up your brainstem, and then this is sensory cortex, right? And this evaluates the actual sensory experience of tingling, stabbing, right? And then we have the front of the brain. And all 4 of these, what happens is the front of the brain shuts off sensory cortex and basically tells you, just don't feel it. So the signal's coming up, but it doesn't get past here, and it just gets stuck. And so you're not feeling the pain. So what about mindfulness? So what we did was we had long-term meditators, and we put them in the scanner, and we applied a very mild electric shock, very, very mild shock to their hand. And we asked them to rate the intensity and the unpleasantness. And first they did it in a normal state, and then in a mindful state. The blue is the normal state, and the green is the mindful state. And MP is mindfulness, and CT is controls. Here's our insula. This is sensory cortex. And what we see is that compared to baseline, there's an increase in sensory cortex for the mindfulness practitioners versus the controls are going down. So the controls are looking like the other 4 forms of pain control versus the meditators looking the opposite. Also in the front of the brain, the same thing. In the mindfulness practitioners, brain activity is going down in the front of the brain versus going up at the controls. Right? So this is the exact opposite of what we're seeing with the other 4 forms of pain control. So now you may be thinking to yourself, what? That doesn't make sense. But let's stop and think about what mindfulness is. Mindfulness is paying attention to the present moment non-judgmentally. They're paying attention to the sensory experience, the painful stimulus, non-judgmentally. They're turning off the judging, and they're just really feeling it. They're really paying attention to it, and they're noticing the stabbing, and the tingling, and the heat, and the actual sensation of it, rather than trying to turn away from it and trying to stop it. But it's not bothering them. And when they came out of the scanner, we had them rate it. Or actually, while they're in the scanner, we had them rate it. And what we see, oops, this got a little messed up. This is intensity. So on a scale of 1 to 10, how intense is the stabbing and tingling? And this side is the unpleasantness. And what we see is that for the mindfulness practitioners, they report this when their front of the brain turns off, they're saying it's just not that unpleasant. So they're feeling it more, but it's not bothering them. So this is really nice, right? Because it's really consistent with what they're being told to do. So this was a study done by some colleagues of ours where they, I love this study. They took people, and this was just 4 days of meditation practice. There's 4 groups. One was real mindfulness. One was placebo. They got a cream. And they were told the cream had something in it to dull the pain. The third group was fake meditation. What that was, they were told they're going to learn how to meditate. They came in and they got told, they were like, okay, meditation's great and wonderful. Okay, now meditate. But they were never told how to actually do it. So they just sat there for 15 minutes meditating. And then the control was they just sat and read books. And what we see is that the placebo worked, both in terms of intensity and unpleasantness. It worked a little bit. But real mindfulness was way more effective, both for intensity and the unpleasantness, right? And what was interesting is that the fake meditation also worked a little bit. Not as well as real mindfulness, but fake meditation. And what we think is that many people these days sort of know that meditation has something to do with watching your breath and being calm and potentially slow, deep breathing. So although they weren't instructed on how to do it, they might have kind of sort of practiced it themselves. Yeah? Okay. So we don't know what's going on here. But the main thing is that the real mindfulness was more effective than placebo. We're going to skip through that. And so then, actually we can do this one. All right. And so then the last bit is that they basically did the same thing, but this time they gave naloxone. Naloxone is a drug that blocks opioids. And what we see is that here's meditation and salt water, and here's meditation and this drug, and it doesn't change it. So this tells us that meditation is not working through the opioid system. That's a different mechanism completely. Because again, many of those other forms of pain control are working through the opioids. So this really is a novel form of pain control. And so with that, the take-home message is that meditation can literally change your brain. And I'd like to thank you all for being here on this beautiful evening. Thank you.